Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund? What is it doing to help people who are caught up in disasters, be it a natural disaster or perhaps some type of a civil war? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very interesting organization. My guest today is Ms. Lisa Doughten. Ms. Lisa Doughten joined the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in 2013 as the chief of the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund. Recently, Ms. Doughten has taken on two new responsibilities, one for resource mobilization and pooled funds. Lisa Doughten, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Very nice to see you again.
I appreciate you being with me again. Let's jump right into it. We're going to get into the fund in just a moment, but let's talk about OCHA. That's the umbrella organization within which you work, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. What is the main mission of OCHA?
OCHA, so the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is that organizes, coordinates humanitarian action around the world. So the Undersecretary General, Mark Lowcock, who also serves as the Emergency Relief Coordinator, works very closely within the humanitarian system, with UN agencies, with non-governmental organizations, within the broader General Assembly, the United Nations, and otherwise, to ensure that humanitarian action is principled and coordinated.
And that agency has played a key role in many disasters. I remember during the 2010 Haitian earthquake, that type of thing, that come into really to bring the service providers, I guess is one way, non-governmental organizations and a variety of UN agencies to coordinate to make sure that relief is getting out to the people, and it all doesn't go to one group and other groups are overlooked, but it really plays a critical role, does it not?
Yes, it does. And it ensures that there's collective action and principled action at the country level, because when an emergency happens, when there is a need for humanitarian action, there's also a need for coordination to make sure that agencies and non-governmental organizations and governments and local responders all work together toward a common purpose of supporting the people that need the humanitarian assistance at the field level.
Well, let's shift over to SURF, the Central Emergency Response Fund, and we'll say that long title, we'll just say SURF from here on out.
Thank you. Yes.
What is SURF? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
The SURF was established in 2005, actually was reformed in 2005. It used to just be a revolving loan and was reformed in 2005 to include a grant facility of $450 million a year. So now, the last time we met 2 years ago, the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had called for the SURF's annual funding target to be increased from $450 million to $1 billion every year. So obviously an ambitious target, but the needs that we see every year, and I think for 2018, they exceed $20 billion worldwide. So you can see that the funding that SURF has to allocate to these crises is actually a drop in the bucket, but nonetheless very important to kickstart activities at the field level.
Do you see that there's been really a uptick in the need around the world? I think of your sister agency, the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. 15 years ago, the High Commission for Refugees was working with about 10 million refugees. This year, the word was 65 million refugees. That's a tremendous increase, and so often the funding and the resources have not accompanied that increase. Are you seeing that same thing in your particular area?
Definitely. In fact, since I think 2005, the needs have quadrupled over time. So the requirements have gone up significantly. Funding also from donors has gone up, but not at the same rate. So we find that whereas SURF used to provide about 8% of the total requirements as coordinated by the UN, now it's down to 2%. So that is a matter of the requirements going up and then the fund remaining at the same level. I did want to also mention that in addition to the SURF, there's also another pooled fund mechanism that you had mentioned, pooled funds. There are 18 country-level pooled funds, basically that are established in ongoing emergencies such as Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria. So all of these crises that are ongoing and protracted crises that need ongoing humanitarian funding.
So the pooled funds countries would be these 18 that you mentioned, Democratic Republic of Congo, plus 17 others, and then that's what a large part or a certain percentage of the budget would be directed towards?
Yes, so they're the two pooled funding mechanisms that are managed by OCHA, by Mark Lowcock as the Undersecretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator. These two funding mechanisms work in concert together. So I would say the hallmark of SURF is that it's global and fast. So it is anywhere, anytime crisis occurs. For country-based pooled funds, they're established in these protracted crises. They work both independently but also in concert, so they help fill critical gaps there. And for the country-based pooled funds, their hallmark, I would say, is empowering the local and national responders.
And that is critical. And if you have an earthquake or something like that, you have to have a rapid response fund. You have to have a rapid response action to provide immediate assistance. If we wait 6 months, it'll be too late.
Exactly.
Many people will die or suffer, whatever the case might be. Well, we're going to get into specific countries and specific projects very shortly. Let's talk a little bit about your 3 objectives on your website. What are your 3 objectives?
Well, the first is promoting early action to response. So for that, I would give an example of the crisis in Bangladesh right now, where people from Myanmar, the Rohingya refugees, are fleeing violence in Myanmar and going to Bangladesh. Their SURF has provided already $19 million last year to support those that were crossing the border and really needed protection and basic services and a place to live. So that is an example of a rapid response or promoting early action to a crisis.
And that's, I'm sure, quite a strain on Bangladesh to help
Very
provide
much
services too, because Bangladesh is a least developing country and it certainly does not have abundant resources, that type of thing, but it's critical to have this outside assistance.
It is. The government has been, OCHA works very closely with the government, as does the UN system, to try to establish land where these refugees can be located. But the difficulty is how long are they going to be there? So obviously it gets into the politics of refugees and refugee rights and the services that they need. But the government of Bangladesh has been working very closely with the UN and is working to support these people that are fleeing violence in Myanmar.
Do they ever think that the Rohingya will ever go back to Myanmar, or will they go elsewhere?
We hope that they will. It's difficult to, I don't have a crystal
answer.
ball to say,
Yeah,
but right
exactly.
now it's the refugees are being hosted in Bangladesh, and there's not an imminent solution at the moment, but we hope that there should be.
Okay. And that's the first objective. What is your second objective?
The second objective is supporting the let's say underfunded crises, so supporting time critical requirements. So for this, I'll give the example of El Nino. So you may be very familiar with that from climate change. In 2015-2016, the El Nino effect really produced floods, droughts across the globe. So SURF ended up providing support to 19 different countries to the tune of almost $130 million. That was in Asia, Latin America. And so some of these, it was I would say a slow onset versus a typhoon or an earthquake, but drought is sometimes very difficult to identify a trigger that just kind of slips into a very dire situation: food insecurity, lack of water, the lack of livelihoods because livestock are dying. So SURF provided a significant amount of funding to that for time critical requirements.
We're starting, you mentioned about drought, which brings to mind climate change. We can't get away from it. We see the glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, the desertification is taking place. Some areas that used to be cold or moderate temperatures are either super cold or super hot now. We're running into a new group of people, climate refugees, and we're seeing more climate refugees around the world. Are you working directly with these? Well, you talk about drought, you're bound to be working with some of them, but there literally must be millions of people who are on the move because of drought, because of some climatic condition that has changed. You can't grow crops, you can't have cattle, you can't survive. The glaciers on the Altiplano in Bolivia are melting, and at some point they're going to be without water. Well, the people on the Altiplano are not going to stay there or they'll die. They have to go down to the lower levels. But are you encountering more of that?
Well, I would think that would go into the overall numbers that total up to over 20 20 billion people, $20 billion, but hundreds of millions of people that need this support. So yes, included in that would be people that are having maybe conflict is resulting because of drought or conflict over resources. I would also cite an example that SURF provided funding to that would be very familiar with the people in the Western Hemisphere, which is the hurricanes Irma and Maria, which hit in the Caribbean in October of last year. SURF ended up providing assistance, about $13 million there to Cuba, Dominica, and then also the regional response. So is this an effect of climate change? Possibly. We also saw earlier last year that the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, had made a call for support to 4 countries that are at risk of famine. It was Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, and South Sudan. And so SURF provided a large amount of money toward that, $130 million to the 4 different countries to support early action there to try to stave off famine, to avert famine in those countries.
Mm-hmm. Was that the main thing that you focused on? Did you do other types of activities, health activities, or was it mostly food and nutrition programs?
Well, in these countries where a famine crisis exists, then the integrated response is always the best way to go. So wherever there's food insecurity, there's always a need for water, sanitation. When people are displaced, also for protection. So it's really a comprehensive and integrated response that the agencies and non-governmental organizations provide. You had mentioned earlier UNHCR, obviously with people fleeing across borders, also displaced people. UNHCR receives SURF funding. So SURF actually provides funding to UN agencies directly, including the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, UNFPA, other organizations such as that. And then they work through their vast network of implementing partners, which is national and international and local NGOs and governments.
Mm-hmm. And those are 3 very important agencies. You mentioned WFP, World Food Program, UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and then UNFPA, UN Population Fund, all very critical programs. And so those are 3 of your main partners that you collaborate with and help fund their programs?
Yes, those are 3 of them, but there are many other UN agencies that funds and programs that SURF provides direct funding to. In addition to that, then, as I mentioned, there's this vast network that they all work with, implementing partners that are people that are on the ground, the national and local and international responders that are there, non-governmental organizations. But just an example of what the funding that we provided to the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, last year when in Fallujah, so SURF provided funding to a maternity ward in the war zone. So
this is in Iraq.
In Iraq, sorry, yes, in Fallujah in Iraq. So it was a really important injection of funding to allow for, with women giving birth. I mean, imagine that. It's difficult in good times, but in a war zone, UNFPA really provided essential services there.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of community access television station, a PBS station, or perhaps an educational institution that has some type of intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're looking at a variety of issues, especially as they pertain to natural disasters, civil wars, or even climate change refugees, and talking about one particular United Nations agency that's providing emergency response. My guest today is an expert on that. My guest today is Ms. Lisa Doughten. Lisa Doughten is the chief of the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, commonly called SURF. Mm-hmm. Lisa, we're talking about these individual countries, and I think it's a good place to start, perhaps to finish too at the end of the program. There's another country, Somalia. We've seen Somalia has come back on the radar screen for many reasons. It was very much on the radar screen back in the 90s, that type of thing. But what are you doing in that particular area, in that country?
Yeah. As you noted, Somalia really has suffered cyclical famine and drought. And as well in 2011, there was a very severe drought and famine as well. Earlier this year, as I mentioned, there was a call by the UN Secretary General to provide really concerted and additional support, and called upon all governments to provide additional support. SURF had provided an early allocation of $18 million in February of this year, February 2017. And that money went to provide for the livelihoods, water sanitation, food assistance. And I'll give one really specific example. So in addition to the funding that was provided, grant funding that was provided, SURF also provided a loan of $22 million to the Food and Agriculture Organization. With that, they were able to vaccinate livestock, to treat the conditions of livestock who were suffering, of course, because of the drought. And they came back to us, the Food and Agriculture Organization came back and said that the result was that they only had to spend 40 cents per head of livestock to support them, vaccinate them. Whereas if the livestock had died, it would have cost $40. So this is where early action is really key, because it saves money. And so the loan that was provided to the Food and Agriculture Organization was key in making sure that it wasn't more expensive and that the action was timely. And if I may also say that I earlier mentioned the country-based pooled funds, so there's a Somalia Humanitarian Fund as well. So whereas SURF was providing funding to UN agencies and procuring, using their economies of scale, procuring supplies, the country-based pooled fund provided money to local organizations and non-governmental organizations to deliver those supplies. So that's how they work in concert together. So they're quite complementary in those ways.
They certainly are, most assuredly. And now, are there other countries in that area of the world? You're in how many countries around the world, and how many people do you impact? 20 million or more per year? Every
year, the SURF provides funding to about 50 different countries. So again, whenever a crisis happens, then SURF can provide funding there. So we'd say about 50 a year. It varies, of course, depending on what happens, where the hurricanes, earthquakes, conflict occurs. Another country I wanted to mention is Yemen. In fact, today, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, announced an allocation from the SURF of $50 million to support those that are being affected by conflict and near famine conditions in Yemen. This is the largest allocation that SURF has ever made, in the history of SURF. So it's quite significant, but we see what's going on in Yemen in the news, and certainly the deteriorating situation there, humanitarian situation of the people, really requires a stepped up support. And as well, there is a Yemen country fund, which works in concert, where they've also given the highest allocation of $68 million. So those working together allow the assistance to be scaled up and also the response to be localized.
And the need is so great. We see Syria and Yemen both, two just horrible tragedies have been unfolding. Yemen not quite as long as Syria. Syria now, I guess, almost 7 years or something like that.
Too long.
But way too long, entirely way too long. One thing I wanted to mention before we go too far, maybe we've gone too far, but our viewers can go to your website at surf.un.org, cerf.un.org, to get more information on what we're talking about today. Before the program, we were also talking about another website you had, donatemiracles.org. What exactly, well, let's say it, www.donatemiracles.org.
Yes. What
exactly is that website, and why should people go to it?
That was actually a campaign that was begun for the season of giving. And it was a group of refugees that had resettled in the United States. And so they have a choir. So they actually sang Silent Night, but they had different words that come only from their hearts as refugees. And so they got together and sang that, and so there's a donate button on that website. But it's actually quite a beautiful song and a beautiful sentiment. It follows the lives of some of the refugees that have settled in the United States.
Exactly. That's very important. Extremely, extremely important. So are there other countries where you're looking at going into, and as you look over the horizon, you see that there's some disaster that's unfolding that maybe won't happen for a day or two or a week or whatever, that you're looking at providing assistance?
Well, looking forward, maybe if I could just actually point to one in the rear,
sure. Yes.
the rear view mirror, but it just shows how SURF is able to provide early action. Last year, 2017, the Democratic Republic of Congo had increased violence up in the Kasai province. So people were fleeing from the violence there. So SURF provided an early allocation in March of 2017 to support the people who were fleeing and also those that were internally displaced. Again, provided 2 additional allocations later in the year, recognizing, again, the deterioration of situation. And then it was declared what we call a level 3 emergency through the Interagency Standing Committee, the Humanitarian system. So that's actually the highest level to really highlight the fact that there is a situation that requires additional support, whether it's advocacy or funding. And as part of SURF's allocation of $100 million that was announced by the Secretary General in December of last year, of 2017, SURF will be providing another $28 million to the Democratic Republic of Congo this year. So this is an ongoing emergency. SURF provided funding early and unfortunately frequently, and again for this year.
Right. And it's so many tragedies, you just can't see them coming. Others, hopefully there won't be a hurricane coming through the Caribbean every year like we saw 2 come through this past year. How do you, as you look at your programs, how do you measure the effectiveness of your programs to make sure that you're reaching your target populations, that you're providing the services, that you're doing it in a very efficient and effective way?
SURF measures its effectiveness based on the number of lives that are saved and the suffering that is reduced. We find that information based upon the monitoring that goes on in the countries. Because each SURF allocation is coordinated at the country level by a UN humanitarian coordinator or a resident coordinator, they then provide reporting back based on this monitoring and review of what's happening and based on the results, the number of people that have received assistance in the various sectors, the number of people immunized, the number of people protected, the number of child-friendly spaces that protected children as well. So we receive this information, and we actually, for the first time last year, we created what's called a results report, which provides quite detailed information. It can also be found on our website, surf.un.org. But that's where we really do focus on results, because that's where, let's say, the rubber hits the road. That's where we measure the lives saved and the suffering that's been reduced.
Well, as you look at the SURF, where you've come over the past 2 or 3 years, where you're going, what do you see as the major challenge as we move forward in dealing with these problems? And apparently they're going to accelerate. They're probably not going to, I hate to say it, I don't want to predict the doom and gloom, but just based upon climate change and everything else going on with the civil wars, internal stress and strains. But what do you see as your major challenge?
I think you're right. Unfortunately, we don't see a reduction. As we look in the past again, we see that there's been either a severe or a gradual rise in the number of people that are affected and require humanitarian assistance. The largest challenge for SURF is obviously funding, because we're the global humanitarian fund for the United Nations. And with that, I had mentioned earlier that we have a new funding target, annual funding target of getting $1 billion per year to receive and also to allocate out to this humanitarian action. So that is our biggest challenge. We saw in 2017 SURF being stretched to its limits with the very high allocations made to the countries, those 4 countries at risk of famine, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to the Rohingya refugees that are fleeing violence in Myanmar, to Bangladesh, and on and on. So I would say really that additional funding, and I would like to say that donors have been very generous, and almost, let's say 99% at the moment of the funding that comes into SURF is from donor governments, from member states. And we really appreciate the generosity. And last year, at the end of December, we had our annual pledging conference, and we received the highest amount ever, $513 million for 2017. So we were celebrating that, also celebrating the diversity of funding, because out of the 126 member states that provide funding, almost 50 of them also receive funding. So SURF is a fund for all, by all. And I'm happy to announce that we also received the first contribution from a zakat, which is an Islamic charitable giving, Zakat Family Foundation from Oman called Al Jisr. So we're very excited about that.
Yes. Well, Lisa Doughten, this is so important, the work you're doing, and the need is so great, but the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund is certainly weighing in and doing its share, but it can certainly get a little more assistance, and that's what we need. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.